Friends, welcome. Welcome to our Friday Mansfield series. It's wonderful to see you all here. A few more arriving. Come on in. Take a seat in the body of the kirk. If you can find a place or two. Great. It's lovely to see you all. My name's Helena Kennedy and I'm the principal here at Mansfield College. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Andy Orchard. I want you to know that Andy Orchard was chosen, hand-picked by the Vice-Chancellor to speak at the great celebration that was in the United States at Easter time. We were all in San Francisco and sort of three grand scholars of Oxford were chosen to entertain the masses who turned up for this great event. And Andy Orchard was one of those people. And although Andy's name was one that I had conjured with many times before, and he's a very good friend of my friend Margaret Macmillan, who was the head of St Anthony's, and we'll explain why in a minute, was that Andy, I'd never actually seen Andy performing. And when I saw Andy, I said to Ian, I sat beside my husband and I said, I am getting him to Mansfield College if it kills me. So there you are, Andy. I had to get you here. And I twisted your arm up your back, and here he is. And so he was one of the people, and I've told people that this, in this last term of my principalship here at Mansfield, I decided I had to get lots of the people here that I really had set my cap on getting to Mansfield. So Andy was one of them. Now, Andy, he won't mind my telling you that he's actually a Cambridge man. He did his Old English, Norse, and Celtic literature degree or his degree in Anglo-Saxon. He did it in Cambridge and was at Queen's College. That was where he did his undergraduate degree, and then came here to Exeter and read English afterwards, and then he graduated and he's done many different things, but essentially I'm afraid he's started life as a Cambridge man until we clasped him to our bosom here at Oxford. He was, as well as being a fellow at St John's College, Oxford, in the 90s, he went off and did this grand thing where he taught in Toronto at a wonderful institute there, the institute, and was the head of an institute there in medieval studies. But he became the head of Trinity College, Toronto, which is a very famous part of the whole sort of academic world of North America. Very distinguished place, and in fact he followed in the footsteps of Margaret Macmillan as the head there, and so he became its provost, was the provost there in 2007, and then was lured here to Oxford to become the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon and a fellow at Pembroke College. To become the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon, let me tell you, is one of those things that stands up there in the academic world as a sought-after post. And so he was lured to Oxford. Andy is married to Claire Brand, who's up there at St Hugh's at the China Institute, and they met in the same class at Cambridge. And here she is, still loyal, sitting with him, sitting here in the audience tonight. So, Andy, I'm really privileged that you agreed to come here and talk about Tolkien. And over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for not mentioning that the last time we met was coming out of an Irish pub in.
Well, we won't talk about that. It was in an Irish pub, and we were drinking Guinness.
Yeah. I've got a handout because I don't trust technology, but also because I think it's quite useful for you to be able to flick backwards and forwards, and I probably won't do it quickly.
Can anybody be helpful? There you are. People are coming down, fleet of foot. They're coming to aid us. I'm going to sit in the front row, actually. Right. It's reserved for Mr. Guy Hands. I don't know that that's true.
Okay, very nice to see so many people here, and it's very nice to see so many familiar faces, and I'm particularly pleased to see Yash Elsner. We were at school together doing classics, and when you get
In
your
North London.
Yeah, North London. We speak several languages up there. Yash, when you get your piece of paper, you'll see something relatively familiar towards the end, and I'm going to ask you to do some translation if you're not careful. Okay, Tolkien's Oxford, Oxford's Tolkien. He would always begin his lectures in the first year in the same way, and I'll do it now. What we got in your dagum, faud kuninga thrum your frunnen, who are the lingers, Ellen Fremadon. So, what we got in it. Listen, we've heard tell of the might of the ancient kings of the Spear Danes, how those mighty warriors did great deeds in days of yore, Yardagum. And the reason he started like that, I think, is quite key to how he interpreted much of his own fiction. And indeed, it spreads an interesting light on his life. It's a triple distancing motif. We've heard of what happened way back then, over there, to people who aren't like us. And if you think of that triple distancing motif as something which runs through all of his fiction, all of his created worlds, but also, in a way, his academic life. Now, Tolkien famously didn't publish very much. If you ask for his academic record, he would definitely be not able to be referred for the ref. He would be fired immediately. Sometimes you hear lazy Tolkien. He was wasting his time. He was writing The Lord of the Rings. He was writing The Hobbit. But as I hope you'll see in the middle of this, he was also working extremely hard. The Rawlinson and Bosworth professor now has the same as a contract, which is a normal contract in Oxford, 36 hours a year. We're required, I know, every year, every single year, every year. No.
No wonder you're worn out.
If you're going to heckle, you'll have to sit up. When Tolkien signed his contract, and I'm a bit worried here because we've got the head of English, it was for 126 hours a year. Let's not go there. Now, Tolkien's phases in Oxford were manifold. He first came here. He stayed for overnight for an interview at Corpus Christi College, and he failed to get in. I think it's quite important to stress that. The first time he tried to get into Oxford in classics, he failed to get in. He came back. He went to Exeter College. And while he was an undergraduate at Exeter College, he started as a classicist, decided he didn't much like classics, found the books in Exeter College Library more to his taste, and I'll come on to that in a second, and swapped to English, was one of the first in the early cohort in English, and graduated with first-class honours in English, but did some very odd things which we don't do anymore in English, and I'll come back to that. He then went to Leeds, and was very lucky when he went to Leeds. So, in fact, the top picture is the picture of Tolkien when he was professor of Leeds. As a very, very, very young man, as he himself said, they took the wrong guy. Kenneth Sysom, who's a name that's going to come up, was Tolkien's tutor in Oxford. And Sysom was the assistant of Arthur Napier, who was a previous Rawlinson and Bosworth professor. Everybody assumed that Sysom would get the Leeds job, and that Sysom would end up as the Rawlinson and Bosworth professor. He was Tolkien's tutor. So imagine your tutor, and you go for the same job, and you get it. This causes a certain amount of interest, let's say, when Tolkien comes back. Tolkien went to Leeds. He did remarkable things in Leeds. He founded all these clubs. He founded Beer and Beowulf, which exists to this day. I took it to Toronto, and it was very successful in Toronto, and it still exists. We just sit and, well, the clue is in the title. I think it's fairly obvious what goes on in Beer and Beowulf. He met there a man called E.V. Gordon, a Canadian, and between him and Gordon, they moved into Norse. And Tolkien's real interests, I'm going to argue, were more in Norse than in Old English, and we'll come on to that. And then at the very young age, 36, he was appointed as Rawlinson and Bosworth professor of Anglo-Saxon. He was the third choice. The first bloke they wanted decided that London was prettier than Oxford and decided to stay there. The second one also had cold feet. Everyone thought they would appoint Sisum, and on a split decision, they went for the young Tolkien. I give you this background because I think that's why he didn't publish much. He was twice appointed professor at an extremely young age over the heads of people who he himself considered to be, in a way, his superiors in Anglo-Saxon studies, and that's a big inhibitor. So he was professor of, Rawlinson and Bosworth professor in Pembroke from 1925 to 1945, but he was already working, he was already doing things. And 1926, he finished his translation of Beowulf. This is the same translation of Beowulf which was eventually published by Christopher Tolkien in 2014. I was very lucky, I got interviewed on the Today programme by Sarah Montague with that last 5-minute section before the news, where, before the crash, the 9 o'clock bell. And she said, so, 1926 it was finished, how come it took him till 2014 to publish it? And I said, well, academics, we don't like to be pushed on deadlines very much. It's an interesting translation, and we'll come back to it. But I want to go back to Exeter College. A young man in Exeter College, in his first year in the college, and he goes into the college library, and there weren't very many books on medieval subjects, but there was a book called Corpus Poeticum Boreale, the corpus of northern poetry, the corpus of Icelandic poetry, which contained all the Old Norse poems that were then, as it were, available. Had been produced in Oxford, of course, in 1883, by Guðbrandur Vigfússon and F. York Powell. And from the pages of this book, there fluttered a piece of paper which is represented on the back of your handout. And if it won't go all the way back. Okay. Yeah, it's going to be a long evening. Okay, there. Oh. Better look on it on your handout. Okay, as you can clearly see, it says Skúla allir kolbi to sækja heim C.S. Lewis, Maria Magdalena Helgibúi, Óðins Day, November 20. Half near, Thín bit Helga Kvíða Hundingsbana, 850 till 100, which I don't need to translate for this learned audience, but it means all the coal-biters should go to C.S. Lewis's place, and it's in Magdalen. And it's on Odin's Day, which is Wednesday, Odin's Day, November the 20th at 8:30. And then in a failure of the author of this letter to have sat through any of my Old Norse classes, it says, your bit is, the word bit, it's sticky, it should be in Old Norse, but so sort of alpha minus, see me later. Your bit is Helga Kvíða Hundingsbana, lines 50 to 100. This isn't Tolkien who discovered this letter, it's me, when I was an undergraduate going back to Exeter College, which was Tolkien's old college. And this is an invitation to Tolkien's group, which he founded with C.S. Lewis, called the Coal-Biters. When I picked up this piece of paper, I was quite thrilled in many ways. I heard of the Coal-Biters. This was a club that would meet and they would translate sagas, and Tolkien was the best, so he would always go first. And then they did all the sagas, and then they read bits of Eddic poetry, and then they would discuss it. A very, very high-powered club, and we'll come on to that in a minute, but this is the club where I think Tolkien cut his literary teeth in many ways, and also dictated how he treated, how he thought of himself as a scholar. Now, why have I still got this piece of paper, you may ask yourself. I did, sort of, even though I'm from North London, I'm still relatively honest, and I did go back after the holidays, and it's possible that my thumb was over the bit saying C.S. Lewis, but I showed it to the librarian, and Oxford librarians, as we know, are the cleverest people in the world, and I said to the lady, this fell out of the book, what do you want me to do with it? And Oxford librarians, being the cleverest people in the world, said, I quote, it's in foreign. Which it is. And she says, it's not a part of the book, why don't you just keep it? So, it's my precious. It's in C.S. Lewis's handwriting, and it refers rather wonderfully to a particular night. Now, if you have no friends like me, you would wonder when this was written, and you'd look at Wednesday, November the 20th, and you'd get an almanac, and you'd find out that the only years that the coal-biters were operating, Wednesday, November the 20th, fell in 1929. So we can date this kind of precisely, and we'll come back to it in a minute. The other thing that's going on in Oxford at the time, which is very different from what's going on in most other places is, and this is where I might get Yash to help me here. C.S. Lewis's book. Can you see the name C.S. Lewis at the top? C.S. Lewis's book by a guy called Henry Cecil Wilde, who Lewis clearly didn't like very much because he spent his whole time writing. I'm not going to translate these. They're incredibly scurrilous, very rude verses in Latin here about what a horrible man Wilde was. And then he does it in Old English. Obviously, this is a very boring lecture. If I see anybody doing this, by the way, I'd be very upset. And then in some pretty good Greek, actually. The Greek's not bad. Where, you know, oh, popoi e megathoima. Oh, God, it's an amazing, it's just a wonder how this horrible bloke can be a lecturer in the University of Oxford. And then he starts some French down here, and then he gives up the will to live and starts trying to work out rude anagrams of Henry Wilde Cecil. This was the zeitgeist, if I can put it like that. So if we go back to a Tolkien creation, this is from the most valuable edition of The Hobbit that's ever been sold. It went for $250,000. And it was written to, as you can see, it's Tolkien's handwriting. It's on page 2, well, not page, after the pictures. And it's to K.M. Kilbride. Again, I'm just going to push the Canadian line here. Kitty Kilbride, a student of his from Leeds, who was one of the happy recipients of one of the first 10 copies of The Hobbit. He wasn't very well known. I'm frankly surprised that they gave him 10 copies. I get about 6, and I'm very happy. He got 10 copies. We know who he signed them to. This is the one that has the fullest inscription, and it's a little bit of... when it was sold by Sotheby's, they said it contained an elvish inscription, which is clear. I mean, I think it was the same librarian. After she left Exeter, Sotheby's hired her, and she was their foreign correspondent. As we know, when Tolkien left, and the Elvish has left the building, it's a bit of Old English. It's quite a good bit of Old English. This is written to a young woman in Vancouver. Felabith on Westwayam, Weram on Kudra, Wundra and Wichta, Wlitashin alond, Erdyard Ilva, Erklen Cluster, Sondun Straven, Dila Sheenath. And, can I get the pointer to work? No. The last word contains a typo. Tolkien messed it up in the last word, as you do, but nobody's perfect. There are many wondrous and amazing things out there in the ways to the west, things which are unknown to men, wonders and creatures. It's an amazingly beautiful land. It's a dwelling place of elves. Can you see in the penultimate line? Ilva. Erdyad Ilva. And there, glorious stones. This is the Jagna stain, if Tolkien people out there. On Dunstrafdom. They shine secretly in mountain caves. Now, he reused part of this elsewhere in his works, but this is the most complete part of it, and I see we have some learned Anglo-Saxonists in the audience, and they will readily recognize that Erdyard, for example, is a unique term. It appears in The Wanderer, which is set text for prelims, so most people have read it, I guess. It appears only in The Wanderer and here. So either Tolkien's discovered a poem by the author of The Wanderer, or I think he's just making it up based on the exams that the text that he was teaching at the time. Tolkien was a great recycler of languages, all languages, but particularly the Germanic languages. Back to coal-biters. Coal-biters, the bit that Tolkien would have translated was always the first bit, and on this next page, no, that one. This is the bit he would have translated that night on November the 20th in 1929. I won't do the whole thing. The translation, by the way, is from my Penguin Classic, so this is where I should show you pictures of my children so you can go out and buy them. Not my children. Well, actually. What do you think, Claire? Our veralderdere atlag aragutlu, nige hetling vötten af himmin fjötlum, thou haft I helgen hugim stjóra, borg hilda boret I brálundli. Not fare boy, not near Kwamu, there are dingy aldere skipu. Van Balifilki, Friesland verda, Ockbutlinga, best antikja. In days of yore when eagles screamed. Doesn't that sound like Tolkien to you? Holy streams poured down from heaven fells. At that time was Helgi the mighty-hearted, born to Borghild in Braulund. Was knight in the homestead, the Norns came, those who were to shape the fate for the noble. They said he'd become the most famed of leaders and be thought the best of princelings. And so on and so forth. It's amazingly stirring stuff. Why were these people reading it? And who were these people reading it? We know who were the coal-biters. We know who was around at the time. Now, this is not a gang of graduates meeting together to have fun. These are some of the most senior academics in the university. Braunholz, a very scary man, professor of comparative philology. John Bryson, fellow and tutor, Merton then Balliol. Neville Coghill, people will know him as for Chaucer, basically, the great Chaucer man. Richard Dawkins, Bywater and Sotheby Chair of Byzantine and Medieval Greek, fellow of Exeter College. This invitation was for Dawkins. How do I know that? I know that because, well, firstly, Dawkins, the Exeter connection, but secondly, Dawkins was the second best at Old Norse, so got to go after Tolkien, if you see what I mean. 50 lines later on. John Fraser, George S. Gordon, very famous character, particularly in the English department. Bruce McFarlane, C.S. Lewis, I forget what happened to him. Charles Onions, C.T. Onions, Oxford English. This is a very elite group. And they chose to spend their time reading Old Norse. Now, we happen to have a letter from C.S. Lewis to, my family's from Northern Ireland, and C.S. Lewis had a proud Ulster heritage, and he wrote to one of his old friends back home, Arthur Greaves, on the 3rd of December, 1929, which you'll note is just after November the 20th, 1929. I've got too many irons in the fire. The Michaelmas Club, the Linguistic Society, the Icelandic Society, and this and that. One week I was up till 2:30 on Monday talking to the Anglo-Saxon Professor Tolkien, who came back with me to college from a society and sat discoursing of the gods and giants and Ausgarth for 3 hours, then departing in the wind and rain. Who could turn him out? For the fire was bright and the talk was good. Next night till 1 talking to somebody else, and on Wednesday till 12 with the Icelandics. This is the event I think we're talking about. So 8:30 till 12, just reading Old Norse. I mean, there's a lot of people who would pay not to do that. It's very hard to keep one's feet in this sea of engagements, and very bad for me spiritually. Well, we know what happened to him. Quite the thing to be doing. Out of this coal-biter material, out of the readings of Old Norse, Tolkien came across poems that we know that he used later on, of which one of perhaps the most interesting is the very obvious Dvergatal, the catalogue of the dwarfs from Völuspá, stanzas 9 to 15. Little bit of background. The world is in chaos. The world rises out of the sea. And then the gods appear, and then the gods have to make something. So what's the first thing that you would make if you were a god? Let's create some dwarfs. And then we have this thing called the Catalogue of the Dwarfs, which, frankly, they do all sound like they come from IKEA. And many of you will have made many of these dwarfs. But if you go through the list, and the translation, again, I apologize, it's mine, but it does reflect what it would have sounded like to an Icelandic speaker. Many of the names that we get from Tolkien. So, Þá gangi veginn öll á rockstólar, ginn heili göð og unna gætust, hverski dverga drokkit, skjapja og byrmis bóð og bláins leggjum. Just look at the names. Durin. Ní, níði, nóri, síðri, austri, vestri, alþjöfa, dvalin, anyone? Beaver, báver, bumber, nóri, ánar, áin, njöðvitnir, vegar og Gandalfur. More. Vindálfur, Thorin, Þráur og Þráin, Þekkar, Lítur, Vítur, Nýr, Nýráður, Heri, Dverga, Reign og Grásvíkar, rétt oftell. I'll now skip into the names. Swig, Wandelf, Windelf, Urge, Knowing, Daring, Spurt, Wise and Bright. This is not Disney. These are characters whose names invite you to interpret how they got their names. Gandalfur. Gandalf means wand elf, as it says here. What's he doing among the dwarfs? Something that, I'm sure it'll be a question on an exam sometime. Last one. Lava Dreitnir, a dog frowsy, Howard, Hougspory, Clayvanger, Glowy, Dory, Ori, Duffer, and Vari, Skirvir, Virvir, Skalvir, Aui, Alvar, Ingvi, Aikenskjaldi, Oakenshield, Valier and Frosty, and so on and so forth. You could spend your whole life making stories out of just these names. And in a sense, that's what Tolkien did. He just changed the parameters to make the languages and the names his own. I had an extraordinary experience last year when I was invited to be part of a Tolkien movie that's coming out, currently under the imaginative title of Tolkien, spelt in several different ways, as all over the place in this university. Tolkien, the movie, but it's about his early life, and it covers his time at Oxford, and in particular his relationship with Joseph Wright, who was one of the most incredible academics, can't say that, a wonderful academic who passed through these halls, a man who was illiterate till well advanced in life, heavy Yorkshire accent, but a genius for language. Went off to Germany, studied Germanic philology, came back, literally wrote the book on Gothic, which was one of the great books that inspired Tolkien. Gothic and Welsh and Finnish were the basis for what he did. So what was Tolkien doing? Here's a complete list of everything Tolkien lectured on over the 20 years that he was doing the job that I'm lucky enough to be doing now. It's an incredible list. In red, Old and Middle English. In blue, Germanic philology. In green, Old Norse, Icelandic. In purple, Celtic, and I want to make a particular comment about Celtic in the next couple of minutes. Beowulf pretty much every year. But apart from that, whatever he liked. You can map these on very directly to the set texts. You can map these on very directly to, in particular, his DPhil students. Every time he had a DPhil student, he would lay on a set of lectures, which was effectively for them. So when he's giving lectures on Andreas, that was the years that Kenneth Brooks was producing his edition of Andreas. Lazy Tolkien? This is a pretty stiff load, and it varies every year. We're lucky enough here in Oxford to have the Tolkien archive, and when the Western Library opened, fantastic library, and so you can get 10 medieval books, 10 manuscripts. You can have 3 or 4 of them on your desk at the same time. I went and I wanted simply to have Tolkien's copy of Beowulf and some of Tolkien's lecture notes on Beowulf, and it's a bit of a theme about librarians here, I realise. The librarian said, "Oh, you can't have both of those at the same time." And I said, "Well, why not? I can get 10 medieval manuscripts." And she gave me a stern eye and said, "But these are valuable." I talked to the Tolkien Trust. It's fine. In the English Faculty Library, we used to have Tolkien's Celtic Library, which was repatriated with the other materials in the Western, I'm pleased to say, when the English Faculty Library, for expansion reasons, wanted to move the Tolkien materials, because, there was a whole room. Tolkien took up some part of it. It was moved, and originally they were going to go off into storage to Swindon, I believe. And, some of us were asked to comment, and my comment was, for a Celtic library to be sent to Swindon is a fate worse than Neath. Collected heavily books in Welsh and Irish. And they had a particular emotional value for him. And here I've just given you a selection of them. They're mostly signed. They contain gems, which unfortunately you're not going to be able to see this very well, but let's see. No, you can't. It's better on here. This is volume 2 of Tornaison's Old Irish Grammar. A standard Old Irish text. It's so standard that I was using it myself in the 80s, and it's still there. It says, J.R.R. Tolkien, Exeter College, Oxford, February 1914, if you can read that bit. And then just below it on the left-hand side, you can see AMDG, which is the Jesuit motto. Ad Maiorem Gloriam Dei, to the greater glory of God. And then just below that, if you can see it, it says E and a B, you can read, and then an M in the shape of a heart. This is the woman who went on to become his wife, Edith Marie Bratt. He was forbidden by his guardian from seeing her. She was an older woman, and she was not a Catholic, and there were two reasons that Father Francis didn't like her. He made Tolkien swear a vow not to see her for 3 whole years. This is coming towards the end of that time, and he sends her a little valentine in volume 2 of an old Irish grammar. I mean, what could be more romantic? In a book of Welsh poetry, also an English faculty collection, signed by Geoffrey Bash Smith, who was his great friend, school friend, who died from wounds just after the Battle of the Somme, and bequeathed his entire Welsh library to Tolkien. Welsh was incredibly important for Tolkien, and Chairs of Celtic came along to Coalbiters and later on to the other groups. Back to Oxford. For reasons I've talked about, Tolkien didn't publish much. He was very fortunate to be invited in 1936 to give the Israel Gollancz lecture at the British Academy and produced what is probably the single most important piece of scholarship on Beowulf as a lecture to the British Academy. And it was called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. And he had this revolutionary idea that maybe Beowulf wasn't boring after all, and maybe it wasn't just a piece of history, but maybe it was a poem. This was quite new for the time, and it seems so obvious, maybe not to everybody, but it seems fairly obvious. But Tolkien gave the most passionate lecture, and again in the English faculty, when I was an undergraduate, they were on open shelves. You could get Tolkien's lecture notes on open shelves. I hope the fact that you can't anymore means they've been moved rather than removed. But he did this several different versions. He did many versions of this lecture again and again and again, and the one he gave in the British Academy is no longer it's not the one that was finally published, if I can put it like that. I've been very lucky. I've been invited to give the Israel Gollancz lecture next year in 2019 at the British Academy, and frankly, I have no idea how you top something like that. I'm going to talk about Cynewulf and Alcuin. What Tolkien did also do, though, is invented languages. And you can see how he invented languages and why he invented languages. This film that's coming out, I knew that they were going to be having problems with, problems. The Tolkien estate, quite rightly, is very fiercely protective of the Tolkien name. And so there was a scene where there are two scenes where two of Tolkien's invented languages are being spoken. And Fox Searchlight, who was producing the film, I said, I doubt you'll get permission to do this. I'm so-called languages consultant. So I was consulting on 9 languages in total, and translations from 9 languages and things like that, and creating a notebook. Claire and I were at a dinner in Pembroke for a retiring fellow, and got back about 11 o'clock or something like that, and there was a message from the assistant director saying, "You're right, we couldn't get permission." And then one of my favourite lines I've had in an email, "I know it's a big ask, but could you create 2 new languages and produce poems in both of them?" This is on a Saturday. And she said, "Wednesday is fine." I did, actually, but it was partly through doing that. You follow the rules, so we'll see whether, and now I've told you, we'll see if anybody notices that they're not Tolkien's language. I think because of that, I have a cameo in the film, where, and I think this is probably the height of my Oxford career to date. In the script, I'm Professor Number 2, but on my trailer, I had a trailer, I was Professor Number 1, and I quite like that. That's the picture I took. And took one look at me and realised that this is why Helena's invited me to follow Stanley Johnson. We share the same sartorial sense of elegance. And the makeup woman said, "How attached are you to your beard?" And I said, "Well, just in the usual way." And they shaved my beard off and gave me a false moustache. And then I met the person who was playing Joseph Wright. Well, it was nice. It was good. It was Sir Derek Jacobi. And I had to teach him to pronounce Gothic and Old English. And we had many goes at it. And he got quite good. But there's only so far you can push a Knight of the Realm to do retakes. And it's like, I think we're done here. And we're out of it. We shall see. My line, by the way, is when Holt is the guy who's playing Tolkien. Gives one of my made-up languages, and I put out the window and I say, "I say, right, is he?" Obviously, I'm hamming this up, right? You should see the film. "I say, right, is he one of yours?" I asked the director what was my motivation, and he said, "We can pay you if you like." Tolkien never gave an inaugural lecture in Oxford. Held two chairs, two of the most important chairs in the Faculty of English. I'm not saying that this is the order of their importance, but the Rawlinson and Bosworth Prize of Anglo-Saxon, where you get fold-out business cards because it's such a long title. And then the Merton Professor, which is the senior, the senior position. But he never gave an inaugural. But he did give a valedictory. And the anniversary of his valedictory is coming up in June next year. And it's worth reading because it shows Tolkien also engaging in the politics of the English faculty. And at that point, politics was all about language versus literature. And Tolkien was firmly on the side of language. And you wonder what he thought when he received a CBE for services to literature, whether he thought this was probably not a good idea. And at the end of it, he looked back over an Oxford career and over his life. And he quoted very deliberately from The Wanderer. And I just want to talk about that for a little while. It's the same poem that he echoed right at the beginning when he dedicated or wrote that poem for Kitty Kilbride in Vancouver. I've expanded his bit so you can see the word Eardjard, which comes here. Útas was in Eardjard al the shippen, or at Burgwar a break Malersa, eld into your work idlustodon. So on this whale stale weezer ye thokta on this der caliph, der per yon thencheth, fraud in ferthe fair oft ye mon, wal slecht the warn and las word aquith. Where come merg, where come mago, where come mother mifa, where come simply a setu, where sind and salad their arms, ala bear, boon ala bern weir, ala thirdness thrum, who see a thrag ye what, ye nap under nick telms wa heo no wera. Tolkien had the best ear for Old English poetry of anybody that I've ever come across. This is an extraordinary passage in all sorts of ways. It's got those two self-rhyming compounds, Eardjard and Whalestale, and for reasons I don't want to go into, but I basically have no friends, so I spend a lot of time just counting things. There's only 10 in all Old English poetry, and 2 of them are here. Why? It lends focus to the passage. Other sound effects, your wat, your nap, frag. He picks all this up and he assimilates it. It's basically an ubi sunt topos. All of those words for what we're missing here. Where went the steed? Where went the man? Where went the treasure giver? Where went the feast placements? What are the pleasures of the hall? Alas, the bright chalice. Alas, the warrior in a byrnie. Alas, the power of a prince. I've translated those deliberately with old-fashioned words because they would have been old-fashioned when they were first heard. These are old words. These are inherited Germanic poetic words. How that time has passed, grown dark under the helm of night, as though it had never been. Retrospection. Triple distancing. What we got in your dagum. It's good sometimes to think about people from way back then, from over there, who aren't us. That was Tolkien's philosophy of Old English literature. And it was a very visceral one. It was one that was essentially born of emotion backed up with fierce intellect. If you read Tolkien's lecture notes, you can see why he would start out with a hall of dozens and dozens of people, and after somebody comment on this, he said, "I'll soon thin them out," and reduce it down to those whom he thought he could teach and influence. It was one of the great privileges of my time as an undergraduate here that literally everybody who taught me was taught by Tolkien or taught by someone who taught Tolkien. And a great man who taught me at Wadham College here, Alan Ward, taught me a history of the English language. And I would go along and we'd meet, and he had piles and piles of paper. There was nothing in his room remotely decorative except for a Sutton Hoo harp and an old copy of the Sunday Times magazine with it had a picture of Bridget Bardot on it. That's how you saw it. And every week the same picture and the same harp. And he sent me an essay on the Ormulum, which is an extraordinary poem. For those of you who know it, you'll realise why nobody's ever read the whole thing. Although my colleague Laura Ash told me yesterday that she's read the whole thing, I simply don't believe it. It's not possible. But it was a language. You would read it for language. And I made some point, it wasn't a very clever point, and Alan got very, very excited about this tiny little point that I'd made in one of my essays on a particular theme on the Ormulum, and he went over to a filing cabinet and he pulled out yellowing pieces of paper. And somebody had set exactly the same question, and some student had made exactly the same point, and the tutor had scribbled in the margin, almost illegibly, something, but it was obviously good. It said, good, do this, blah, blah, something. But it was very positive. And he said, do you see? And I said, what is it? And he said, that's an undergraduate essay that I was set. And so I thought, yeah, Oxford essays don't change much over the decades, do they? And I said, who's that scribble? And he said, that's Tolkien. And I said, oh my God, Alan, what does it say? And he goes, I never could read it, and I was always too scared to ask. Oxford doesn't change. In Beowulf and the Critics, Tolkien wrote, summarising his thoughts, and I apologise for the length of the quotation, but I couldn't think out where to stop it. This is Tolkien towards later on, after the Gollancz lecture, after he's delivered to the British Academy, after he's published the essay that changed the face of Beowulf scholarship and still continues to reverberate. Again, this is not academic prose. Beowulf is not a primitive poem, it's a late one, at the end of an epoch. At the end of an epoch, using the materials then plentiful of a day already changing and passing, which has for now forever vanished, swallowed in oblivion, using them for a new purpose, with a wider sweep of imagination, if with a less bitter and concentrated force of mood. Beowulf was already antiquarian, in a good sense, and it now produces a singular effect, for it now itself is to us ancient, and yet its maker was telling of things already old and weighted with regret, and he expended his art in making keen that touch upon the heart which sorrows have, that are both poignant and remote. So that if the funeral of Beowulf moved once like the echo of an ancient dirge, it is to us a memory brought over the hills, an echo of an echo. There's not much poetry in the world that has this effect. This is the line I find interesting. And though Beowulf may not be among the very greatest poems of our Western world and its tradition, I happen to agree. My heart is still in the classics, but I just wouldn't want to take it as a degree. It has nonetheless its own individual character and peculiar solemnity which no comparisons can take away, its own ancient cadences of verse, its own thought. To recapture such echoes is the final fruit of scholarship in an old tongue, and the most honourable object, rather than the analysis of a historical document. Fruit that is good for all to eat if they may, but which can be gathered only in this way. For such reasons, ultimately, do we study Anglo-Saxon. Thank you.
And that was really terrific. When did Tolkien die?
1983, I think.
1983.
Something like that, yeah.
And so he saw his books becoming
Oh, yeah.
about
And he hated it,
hugely
yeah.
successful. Well, that's why I wanted to ask you
Well,
about.
no, he liked it at the first, and then when they went to the States, and he
Became
wasn't very
really-
keen with the way that they were depicted in the States.
Well, because my memory is of being
Got his death date wrong,
an adolescent teenager, and Tolkien being hugely popular amongst my contemporaries. And I think that would have been, 1966, 1967.
It became tied up heavily with the sort of psychedelic hippie movement. West
Yes.
Coast picked up very much. Lord of the Rings was picked up lots on the West Coast.
And he saw all of that happening, and
he did, and I think it puzzled him really, because he just wanted to be an academic and to teach 126 hours a year.
How do you think he would have felt about the movies?
Oh, I'm sure he would have hated them. In fact, I mean, this is why I'm fairly confident that the movie that I'm in may not appear. The Tolkien Foundation is very fierce, and that they've had dealings with Peter Jackson, for example, those movies, and they didn't like them, and I can see why, because they're too much Dungeons and Dragons, swords and sandals. It's too
far away from the.
It's if you read what he writes about Beowulf, it's much more about. It comes out of the First World War. It's those school friends that he had.
Who died.
Not just Geoffrey Bash Smith, but Christopher Wiseman, people like that. Many of his friends died. His closest friends died. He himself was wounded, and it was a horror for him in all sorts of ways. And I think the way that he wanted to deal with it was by that kind of distancing motif. You set something way back when and over there, and the books are all different. I mean, I confess freely that I've never got to the end of The Hobbit. So, I mean, don't spoil it for me. I think.
I'll tell you later.
No, I think Sherlock comes in at the end. But I did love The Lord of the Rings. My father gave me a copy of The Lord of the Rings for my 10th birthday, and I think at that age I just thought I want to read a really big fat book that doesn't have any Russians in it, and which limited the options. And so Lord of the Rings kind of did it, and I felt even then that kind of attraction. And that I mean, definitely, like a lot of people, that's what pushed me in the direction of
I want to ask you about, as would be my wont, I want to ask you about the older woman that the priest didn't want him to have anything to do with. No. She's a younger woman. You married a youthful person.
Yeah.
I know she's the same age as you, but she's a very youthful. Tell me about what happened to him.
No, she was Edith Marie Bratt. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. They were both orphaned, and they both ended up in the same lodging house, and they met and they fell in love. And incidentally, I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, to be in Mansfield, but before Mansfield was in Oxford, it was in Birmingham.
That's right.
And this is where all of that love story started. And it's an extraordinary thing. If you're told by your priest you will not see her or contact her for 3 years until you come of age, and you fulfill that, and you manage to sign not only a love token in February, I'm hoping it was the 14th, E Heart B for Edith Marie Bratt, but also to include the Jesuit motto of the man who's preventing you from marrying her. And the day after his birthday, he got back in touch with her, and she was stepping out with someone else, as you might expect. And he travelled to see her and
wooed her back.
Isn't that a great story?
Yeah. Did she become a Catholic to marry him?
They were a very Catholic family. Yes, indeed. Yeah, and so they had several children, and the story is there. And a lot of the stories, the original stories, The Hobbit and so on, was created to entertain the children.
Yeah.
And Christopher Tolkien has become a great editor. I mean, a really, truly great editor. It's very hard to edit something so close, his father's works. And I would also say Christopher Tolkien taught Norse, Old Norse, here in Oxford for several years, and is a scholar in his own right. And Priscilla lives in Oxford still.
Wonderful. Now, look, there are people up there who are aching to ask you questions. So who would like to come in first? Come on. Oh, look, there she is. Our very own medievalist, our very own, come on. Here's Lucinda, who teaches English here.
Hi, Andy.
Hi.
Thank you, that was great. I was working on the papers that Tolkien, when Tolkien did the transcription of Anglo-Saxon,
Oh, yeah.
and responding to what Helena said about how much he liked being popular. And all the notes for the transcription were written, well, some of them were written on the back of student essays, which obviously were never returned. But quite a lot of the notes, I don't know if you've seen this, but quite a lot of the notes were written on the back of little slips of paper that said, "Thank you very much for the interest you have shown in my book. I'm sorry I can't write to all of you." So he was using up those slips. I mean, I guess it was 1962 or something when he was translating it.
Yeah.
So he was clearly sending out little photocopies of this to people who'd read the book.
He died in 73, by the way. I just wanted to correct myself. But yes, but he was I mean, he would write things on slips of paper, and it's often it's quite interesting to read the back always of slips of paper. And what's extraordinary to me is I was quite familiar with Tolkien's handwriting because it's beautiful. He's got an excellent calligraphic script, and it's very, very distinctive. And when Alan Ward showed me this scribble, and it was, people write quickly when they're producing things in a hurry, and it was pretty much illegible. I couldn't read very much of it at all. But he was extremely popular with the students that he didn't drive away, I think. But he's in his valedictory again. He says, "I've often been told by people that what a terrible lecturer I am." And this is kind of this was his excuse for not having given.
Well, Dougie Gray, who was the Tolkien, Tolkien fellow, is my neighbour. Well, was my neighbour. He died a few weeks ago. And he said, I used to sit in the front row. God, he was boring.
I think he was in a funny way quite deliberately boring. If you look at the range of topics that he was teaching, that's astonishing. We all coast. Well, no, we don't. We never coast. But there's a certain amount of repetition. But with Tolkien, what you get very much the sense of is that, and I have to say this is the sense I get, every time I teach Beowulf, I find something new. And I don't think it's just because I'm, not picking it up in the right way. I think it's a poem that repays rereading. And in a funny way, I think that's what Tolkien was trying to aim for too.
Yes.
What a Thucydide in Caterma as I, as we used to be taught. Yeah.
Lovely. Who else would like to come in? Oh, stunned into hypnotic trances. Come on, there's a hand in the back row up there, great.
Thank you. At the risk of asking a question that everyone in the room knows except me, why was the group called Coal Biters?
Oh, thank you. Yes, Kolbita is an Old Norse term. It comes out. It refers to people who are so lazy that they never leave the fireside. And so while everybody is out in Iceland dealing with the sheep, hay, everything else, the Kolbiters will be just huddled by the fire, so close to the fire it's as if they're biting the coals. And so it's the name for somebody who's completely useless, according to everybody else's. You can see why they call themselves by everybody else's opinion. But here's the twist. Always the Kolbitar, when the call comes, when the bully comes, when the berserks arrive, when it's time to put up or shut up and everybody else is falling by the wayside, the Kolbitar will rise up like the meek, mild-mannered little people, the hobbit-like creatures they are, and will defeat the forces of evil and the forces of darkness. It's not quite how I see C.S. Lewis, but yeah.
Who else would like to come on in? Yes, Catherine.
You talked about being asked to create 2 languages by Wednesday.
Yeah.
Did
That was
you?
last Wednesday, though. I'm not doing it now.
Did you? And how did you go about creating 2 languages that of course must have been different? How do you approach that?
I think Tolkien's languages are incredibly important and should be, in a way, studied much further. And they tell you a lot about his interests. So it's sort of fairly well known that he uses elements of Welsh, he uses elements of Finnish. He would combine elements of existing languages. And Tolkien's languages, very much like Tolkien's names, they work because they come from a philological background. the two languages that they wanted was one when he was one of his very first languages, which he called Nevbosh, Newspeak, which he invented, and it had elements of school Latin, school French, school German, little bits of back slang, and so on. And so it was, without using the same words and forms and without even using the same languages, I just put together some basic things so that you should be able to, well, you won't, but it's possible that one could understand how you got from A to B. And I heavily annotate. I don't want to get into trouble with the Tolkien Foundation, Tolkien Trust, because we're trying to be respectful here. But I annotated exactly how you did it. Tolkien's poem in Nevbosh was a limerick. And so I started out by writing a limerick in English. And I'm not going to be able to, but it starts out, there was an old man on the log. Then there's a frog. Then there's a dog. That's all you need to know. And it's very similar to the limerick that he started out with and then moved it. So that I started out at a distance and then made it a further distance, but trying to do it in the same way. The second one was in a funny way, easier because we had a Finnish director. And so I produced something which was basically made up of Old Irish, which Tolkien didn't really use very much, and Icelandic, which he knew but didn't really use much in his languages, but again, a kind of blend. And I gave it to the director, and he said, it doesn't sound Finnish enough. And I said, well, it's your problem, I'm not. So then he literally finished it off. And so it hopefully sounds as if it's a made-up language without sounding as if it's one of Tolkien's languages, which, that's not what we were trying for at all. And the point of the story is the love story. Mm-hmm. And just after they filmed in Oxford, they were going up somewhere near Manchester Airport to film the Battle of the Somme. I probably just filmed it in Manchester Airport, I think. I just turned up the volume a bit. But that's the story, and then that's where the tales come from. And it is that old, the lectures, the people who taught him. He was taught by some of the great figures, just because he happened to be in the right place at the right time. And I mean, there's no question that Oxford was the single most important influence, geographically speaking, as it were. So, yeah.
Who else? Yes, Dana.
Thank you, first of all. Thanks so much for this absolutely glorious lecture, and especially I just love this speech about the end of an epoch and the use of echo here. My question is, what are your thoughts about the future of reception of him, especially with the move towards more commercial, kind of the film, merchandise, and possibly this is the fear of like a whole generation that will maybe, God forbid, not read the books, but just see the films and engage with that.
A wonderful scholar, Tom Shippey, who followed Tolkien as professor of Anglo-Saxon at Leeds, and was here. He was a fellow at St John's College. And he wrote a book called Tolkien, Author of the Century. Not the author of the century. He's not saying Tolkien's the greatest thing ever, but Tolkien is very much tied to the century in which he lived and which he wrote, and he's of that time, and I think that's how he will be seen. I think it's interesting that with Christopher producing all of these backstory, this Silmarillion and the other kinds of materials that are going on, that there'll be, the archive grows. And it's worth studying. What I would like to see studied more is Tolkien's Anglo-Saxon academic work. Just because he didn't publish it doesn't mean it's not amazing. His edition of Beowulf, or his translation of Beowulf, came out in 2014. I'm currently producing an edition of Beowulf for OUP because I'm convinced that's what the world is desperate for at this stage. But I'm trying to do it in a way that mimics the Jeb editions of Sophocles that I grew up in with parallel facing page text and translations and AppCrit and notes and all the rest of it. And I'm trying to do it in a way that is deeply unconservative. So Beowulf scholarship is extremely conservative, and I'm going to go in and pretend it's like a classical text and amend it. And I kind of assumed that this would be very rebarbative to the way that Tolkien would have worked. Not at all. He amends left, right, and centre with brilliant notes, and at least half a dozen of what I would say were my most, the Palmary emendations of which I am most proud. Tolkien will have it in his notes and will usually say something like, "It will be obvious to everyone that," and that sort of thing. All right. So I think his scholarship in that sense is definitely worth revisiting and will live on. And of course, there's a whole industry now in people studying Tolkien for, let's say, lectures and so on, and lecture series. And in fact, I'm co-supervising next year an incoming DPhil student who's working on the Silmarillion and Old Norse literature, which I'll have to read the Silmarillion now.
So there's no sense in which there's I mean, in fact, the interest in Tolkien has grown, but will people read the novels or watch the movies?
I think they'll go back. I think there's just been a deal done to redo The Lord of the Rings in a way that is more faithful to the spirit of the books. So a sort of, and I think that will set up the dialogue where then people will go will go in.
That's
I mean,
interesting.
you know, I understand people still read Shakespeare even though there's loads of movies.
It's true, it's true, it's true. Ooh, good. Look, there you are.
Thank you. As you mentioned, you did ASNAC at Cambridge. So at Cambridge they
Don't
put...
keep mentioning it.
Sorry. They put Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic in a separate department, whereas
Yes.
if you're doing an English degree here, they're combined. And it really confuses people when I say I'm doing a Master's in English, but specialising in Norse.
I know, you gave a very good paper yesterday, wasn't it?
Thank you. But I was wondering, is the fact that Norse and Celtic are still included in the English department rather than separated out, is that a legacy of people like Tolkien?
Effectively, it is. And I was very lucky or unlucky, depending on your point of view, but I was accepted into Cambridge with a classics scholarship, so I was supposed to do classics. And I took a year off, and I spent 3 months in Iceland, walking around Iceland. And I thought, I really don't want to do classics anymore. And so I did Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic, which then was a one-part tripos, 2 years. You could only do 2 years. And I just did all the languages. So I did Welsh and Irish and Norse and Old English and Latin and probably something else. And after 2 years, I was supposed to go back to classics, but such was my deep fear of having to sit in classics lectures that I went to see my tutor, Naomi Siegel, professor of French now. And I walked in and she said, so how's it going? And I said, I'd like to leave. And she goes, you should probably shut the door and sit down. And we had a chat. And she said, do you want to go to another university? And I said, I don't know. Can you do that? She says, I don't know. Let's see. And there's a thing called incorporation, where you can swap between Oxford, Cambridge, London, the usual suspects. But why would you do that? So I did 2 years in Cambridge doing ASNAC, and then 2 years here in Oxford doing course 2. And the letter I have from Oxford is wonderful, where they said we will take you if you get a first in your ASNAC exams, but we wish to insist that we count your 2 years at Cambridge as 1 year in Oxford. And because I was going to do classics, I had a grant in those days, and I did both. So I mean, I like to say that I'm one of the few. There are other people who've done this, but I have an Oxfam degree as an undergraduate, so I've seen both of those from both sides, and I think there are enormous advantages for being a strict medievalist in doing ASNAC, and I wish we did more Celtic here, and I wish we did more Latin here. But I think there are massive advantages in seeing English literature as being truly connected all the way through, and the old Beowulf to Virginia Woolf. So, I mean, this is where I sort of choose to be, and I can see advantages in both systems, but I think the Faculty of English, Language and Literature, it has a coherency about it that I admire.
Up with Oxford. Right, a hand up at the back there, please.
You mentioned he later in life, well, maybe before, but he was interested in university politics. But I wonder how interested he was in wider politics. And you talked about the First World War being an influence, but there seems to be lots of debate over the influence of the Second World War, like Tom Shippey, you mentioned.
Exactly,
there's quite a lot of arguments. Was he incorporated, and was he living in his complete world and not really interested in what was going on?
I mean, he didn't fight in the Second World War, but he acted as a air raid warden, and he was very active. And of course, he had his children were involved, so he was as involved as he could be. I mean, there are some very interesting, disturbing, enlightening letters because he was a Germanicist. There was an assumption about, and he had contacts with or contacts. They contacted him. People who were associated with the Nazi regime, and there's a letter where he says, unfortunately, I'm not a Jew. I don't have the advantage of being connected with that most admirable and educated and brilliant of peoples. I paraphrase, but he was very in tune to that kind of side of things, and the whole of the idea of the horrors of the wars that take place in the course of The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and before that, is this utter horror of the mechanization of war and mass killings, and trying to get back to human, at the human level of honor and of bravery and of deeds of daring do. And this also, I think, answers. Tolkien couldn't write women characters to save his life, and there's often been comments and criticisms about that, and the movies inevitably introduce more women, more female characters. I'm not sure that it was anything more than he's seeing it very much from this. This is how the First World War was fought, and there weren't, it was all a bit grim out there on the Somme. And he idolised women in a funny way, which is partly that Edith Marie Bratt thing, and thought they should be kept separate. That's
his education would have
that's
been
what I was
male,
saying.
and
it's his.
That exclusiveness was part of his whole life's experience of it being male. Yeah, the gentleman there, please. Thank you.
It's actually in relation to the last question in a way. The introduction, I suppose it's to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, has this very long disclaimer about how you mustn't in any possible way take this to be in any sense related to anything that might have happened in this time. And he protests too much, it seems to me. And I just wonder whether you have some thoughts about that. Because, of course, it is an Oxford in which arguably all those working who are working here through the war, of which, of course, it was an older generation, including many of the refugee scholars, were inevitably having to reflect on through their work on what was going on.
Yeah, I think you're bang on, and I would take it back to what I was saying at the beginning about this is the sort of the Beowulfian angle. It's like it's got to be over there and way back when and other people, and it's this triple distancing motif, which I think you can see, but it's a self-protection motif as much as anything else. I can think about it if it's not right here, and I'm not having to live it at the same time. But I mean, while you've got the microphone, Yash, I think we should. I mean, you and I went through this extraordinary educational system where every week we were given a piece of Shakespeare to turn into Greek iambics, and we'd be given every other week. You'd be given a poem by Christina Rossetti, and you'd have to turn it into Latin elegiacs. But it hasn't harmed either. Well, maybe. I don't. But we had the same kind of education that Tolkien went through as a very, very, very old-fashioned school in Birmingham.
Well, and particularly C.S. Lewis from.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Who else would like to ask a question? Well, Andy, that was terrific. It really was great, and thank you for answering those questions in such an interesting way. And I hope that you'll join me in saying this was really just a delight. Isn't Oxford lucky? And so I want to say we're lucky too. Thank you for coming and doing this. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.